Good afternoon, everybody. It is just 2:01, so we're going to give another minute or so to let people finish logging in, and then we'll get started. Okay, well, it's 2:02, and we have a lot of ground to cover here. So I suggest we get started as folks continue to log in. The presentation is being recorded, so you can always pull it up and go back and share for future reference. So good afternoon again. My name is Emily Lamond. I'm an environmental partner at Coleshots, and I'm joined today with my colleagues Don Richardson at EWMA, and Howard Tolan at SterlingRisk. And the three of us have been, over the years, increasingly talking and wrangling and trying to get our arms around PFAS, an emerging contaminant that has certainly been grabbing the headlines and shaking up the commercial and industrial real estate industry more and more day by day. So, we've been hashing out these challenges in recent days, and are happy to and excited to share it with everybody today, and start and continue a really key important conversation in our industry. So with that, we'll start with our next slide. So quick orientation, 30,000-foot view of where we are. We are in the realm of the concept of contaminants of emerging concern, affectionately also known as CECs. And this is the general concept of where you have chemicals that are commonly used in multiple industrial processes, commercial uses, products, whatnot, that have been largely unregulated. But as studies and more data and health concerns are raised and ecological impacts are raised through scientific development, regulators start trying to catch up. So the industrial uses are long time, which means they have been discharged and disposed of and handled in multiple operations. And then we start regulating them, which of course then completely changes the function of diligence, operational liability, remediation liability across the board. So that's the world that we're working in here. There are a number of different chemicals that are considered CECs. 1,4-dioxane is a hot one. Multiple types of plasticizers, even pesticides that have been, approved under federal law. But today we're focusing on PFAS, P-F-A-S. We'll get into more details there. And they again have been the headline grabbing recently. So next slide, please. So you may be familiar with the concept with the names Teflon, GoreTex, or Scotchgard. These are household names for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a class of man-made chemicals that have that refer to up to 10,000 different type of variations, and they're used in nonstick pans, in waterproof textiles, stain-proof textiles, and then multiple other products, even dental floss, which is one of my favorite examples. So they're used very widely because of a unique number of unique characters. Next slide. I should say that there's a lot of information in these slides that it's just we cannot get into all of the details. So put them in the slides for future reference, but we're going to fly through a little bit more quicker. Unique chemical properties. I think one of the most two important points are they repel water and fats and oils, which make them very useful. They are highly efficient surfactants, which means they reduce friction and can be and therefore very useful in all sorts of industrial operations. And they also are highly effective fire suppressors, which means that they have been used in firefighting foam for decades. A key point about them is that they contain the carbon-fluorine bond, which is one of the strongest in nature, which means the molecules don't break down, and which means they stay in the environment, well, forever. This is why they're nicknamed forever chemicals. They also are water soluble, which means they latch on to water molecules, which means that they are highly mobile. It means wherever water goes, PFAS can go, whether that's groundwater, surface water, air, water droplets in the air, so widespread air deposition with these chemicals as well. Next slide. Along those lines, practically ubiquitous, these chemicals are being found in 98% of the US population's blood at varying concentrations, and being found throughout the environment, including Antarctica. The problem here, and the reason why regulators are focusing on them, is because increasing studies are finding links to cancer, immune system damage, liver damage, birth defects, and more. And one of the challenges is that these impacts are being found at incredibly small concentrations of exposure, which is then driving, and I'm not being over dramatic by saying astronomically low regulatory standards. We're talking about less than concentrations in parts per trillion, and which raises challenges that Don is going to dive in more in a technical standpoint. Next slide. We touched on this before. The main takeaway point here is we're using firefighting foam, which means that we find them in military bases, airports, anywhere there could have been a chemical, solvent, or petroleum-related fire. They're also found in landfills, multiple industrial facilities across the board, wastewater treatments, and more. So when you're doing your diligence, it raises a lot of challenges about looking into historical operations, and all of a sudden, with the new regulatory standards being implemented and developed, it's a game changer for our diligence analysis. Next slide. Regulatory status, federal levels, this is a big deal. EPA is in the process of identifying 2 types of the PFAS chemicals. Remember, again, this is a family of thousands and thousands of different types of chemicals. The 2 most notorious and well-studied are PFOA and PFOS. EPA is in the process of listing them as hazardous substances under the federal law CERCLA, which is more commonly known as a Superfund law. EPA is on track to meet their schedule to have this regulation and designation final and effective summer of 2023, so that's less than a year from now. And this triggers Superfund liability, which means reporting obligations, enforcement authority, gives EPA authority to go after you for cleanup costs, issue cleanup orders, and then opens up the door for private litigation for contribution and cost recovery actions. Being listed as a hazardous substance under CERCLA also has ripple effects under other federal statutes. For today, we're going to stay focused on remediation liability because that's really the most immediate impact to the commercial real estate industry. But as a whole, we're looking at EPA is taking very much a whole of agency approach to this. And they're also probably under RCRA, which then triggers waste disposal issues that, again, Don's going to talk a little bit more. Next slide. We're going to skip over this. Many states are taking many different actions. So wherever your property is located, you got to check, make sure your counsel and consultant are checking on status of PFAS regulations in that particular state. It's changing on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. 2 examples. New Jersey, we have both enforceable groundwater and enforceable soil remediation standards at very, very low levels. They are effective, they are being enforced, and they are driving ongoing remediation. They're driving challenges in diligence and reopener risk under biennial certifications. It's happening every day now. You know, so New Jersey is by far one of the more aggressive states in regulating PFAS. So we are very much in the trenches in New Jersey. New York is also requiring any property with an open site remediation case has to sample for certain PFAS chemicals, even if there's no known source. So it's really like more of an information fishing expedition. So next slide. This is my issue spotting slide. Clearly, we cannot get through all of this. We could spend all day talking about how these issues are coming up. Again, we've mentioned diligence, reopener, insurance exclusions, and challenges of getting coverage. Howard's going to dive into that. ISRA, if you have an ISRA trigger, you got to be talking to your environmental counsel and your LSRP about how you're going to tackle PFAS risk. And of course, you got to look back at your former and existing indemnities, any releases or waivers or covenants not to sue that have been previously negotiated with DEP or EPA or other agency. These are all, no one was anticipating these issues in the past. So next slide, please. There we go. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Don now. I know we just ran through a ton of information. Hopefully this is oriented enough. We can get into the kind of the more nuts and bolts to what we're seeing and how we're getting our arms around the risk and being smart about managing it, getting the deal done. Don, no pressure. It's all you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. Great job. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Don Richardson. I'm the president of EWMA. My background is in hydrogeology, although I have gotten involved with a lot of different applications of hydrogeology as it relates to doing remediation work in and around the tri-state area, as well as across the country. So I'm real pleased to be able to share some practical insight into what I've experienced, I'd say, over the last several years dealing with PFAS in particular. Emily did a great job in framing out the background of PFAS. The one thing is I look at PFAS as it relates to New Jersey. We're in the Wild West, and New Jersey is the frontier. New Jersey has been leading the league in regards to pushing on the regulation of these particular compounds, which has created some challenges and some uncertainty in the contaminated property transfer arena that the three of us operate in. But we're here to give you good news too, with regards to there are ways to mitigate these risks and address the risks in a way to effectuate and consummate these deals. The only other thing I'll mention, this pretty picture illustrates sources for PFAS. Everything that I think about on a day-to-day basis really pivots around a conceptual site model, affectionately known as an acronym of a CSM. The conceptual site model is extremely important as you evaluate PFAS risks in the environment. And you see some of the applications here, source areas associated with firefighting foam and how that may eventually impact, infiltrate through soils into groundwater resources, eventually if potentially impacting then recharge areas such as surface water, et cetera. But another area that has emerged that's of quite concern is air emissions from former manufacturing facilities. Similar to when we looked at lead years ago as it relates to gasoline and the leaded gasoline issues, very similar with PFAS, that we're starting to find these in surface deposits and runoff into surface water from air deposition. So we'll keep this model in mind as I kind of go through a few more slides. Next slide, please. As we look at, before we look at due diligence, one thing to put in perspective here, Emily mentioned parts per trillion. That's the world that we work in with PFAS. A part per trillion can be thought of as one eyedropper in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's 660,000 gallons to one eyedrop. Another way that I like to think about parts per trillion is 30 seconds in a million-year period is a part per trillion. So we're dealing with extremely low concentrations. Now, we used to live in the parts per billion world. Now we're in the parts per trillion world from that perspective. As we look at due diligence, I can't overemphasize enough the need for very careful review of the different potential uses and operations on a particular property. This requires more than just a cursory look at a number of, I know, resources that exist out there on the web that might identify firefighting or some other application that may have been a source to PFAS. This really requires a much deeper dive into permits, waste streams, and the old material safety data sheets, now just called safety data sheets, for the storage of chemicals on site. Those forms have a tremendous amount of information to navigate if truly a PFAS compound was used on the site. Next slide. So as we go through due diligence, we then really identify the occurrence or the potential occurrence of PFAS. Our job, quite frankly, defaults to looking for ways to not really go out and test. The reason being is this is such a ubiquitous substance. We want to have very clear rationale to be testing in the first place. So if it is determined through due diligence that testing is necessary, then it's critical then to carefully design and go back to that conceptual site model, now on a very site-specific basis, to reconcile and understand where these potential sources could exist, prepare a sampling plan that can hone in on where these potential chemicals might exist, and then look at potential upgradient impacts for those chemicals. So that sampling plan is absolutely critical. These compounds, because we're dealing in parts per trillion, also have a lot of very careful protocol with very experienced investigators necessary for and to be on these sites to analyze these chemicals so we can get reliable data. Once we get that data and we can prove its reliability, then we can update our conceptual site model to really understand, is it coming from off-site source? Is it an on-site source? And then what do we do? Next slide. So when we detect and confirm PFAS, the first thing I say is, let's not panic. They're just like with any chemical, we have to go through the process of understanding, characterizing, verifying the results. They're very interesting chemicals because there's so many of these PFAS, and right now commercially, they can test reliability of about 30 of these different compounds. There's literally thousands, upwards of 5,000, I've heard upwards of 10,000 variations of this chemical. So, but right now commercially with the 30 different PFAS related compounds, it's a good idea to go ahead and evaluate all of those compounds, even though they're not all regulated, so you can come up with a fingerprint of that particular source. That could become very critical when you're trying to differentiate potential off-site sources or even on-site sources that might be related to the PFAS. For example, a fire that has occurred on a site that we've been working on had very high concentrations of PFOS, one of the compounds that Emily mentioned that are regulated in New Jersey. We found that there were upgradient PFAS. In this case, though, they were a PFNA. So we were able to differentiate. Unfortunately for the client we were working for at that site, they had to address that particular area of concern because of the significant fire that was suppressed using the AFF foams that contain the PFOS variety of the PFAS compound. So my point in all this is that it's very important to fingerprint, have a good understanding of what may be coming onto the site and on site when you're developing a cleanup plan. As it pertains to waste disposal options, I'm holding my breath, quite frankly, over the CERCLA passage of the rule. And if people can contact their legislators and other folks to try to delay that, we're in a process that we have the science lagging behind and technology is lagging behind some of the regulations that are being passed. And this could have a far-reaching effect to especially the waste disposal area, as people who run waste disposal facilities, whether this trickles into RCRA, as well as just CERCLA liability that Emily mentioned, remains to be seen. But the fear is there. And my concern is, well, I have a place to dispose of these wastes if I transfer it to a media that needs to be dealt with from a cleanup standpoint. So something that we obviously have to keep a very close look at or our eye on into the next year. Next slide. And this is my final slide, just to talk a little about cleanup. Cleanup in a nutshell is very much at its infancy. The focus of late with PFAS is first the delineation and then the evaluation of receptors. Receptor, the most important receptor really being, in most instances, drinking water. And that's been the focus for PFAS, is the receptor of a drinking water, community water systems, et cetera. You've been seeing it in the news. You may have even gotten a letter in the mail that your public system has been impacted by these compounds at very low levels. So the technology has really been focused on treatment, and they've made some really pretty significant breakthroughs of late. As Emily mentioned, it's a very recalcitrant compound to degradation naturally. So one has to really work to figuring out how to mitigate it from really one of two ways, either using some form of what we call an absorption type technology or capture technology. However, that just captures the compound to then in the future have to transport that somewhere else as a waste. And that is compared to destructive technologies. And that is where this whole our business has to go in searching for reliable destructive technologies, because just transferring these chemicals to other disposal areas, I think presents real challenges to then those regulated disposal facilities that are now asked to accept these wastes. So just again, my recommendation, if you do have PFAS, is consider short-term remedies, because there's fast evolving longer-term solutions. And I think the key here is mitigating the transport of these chemicals that might be on your site to encounter receptors that you've identified in your conceptual site model. So it should really be engineering controls. It could be pump and treat. It could be very simple source removal, anything to mitigate that compound getting into the water streams and into a migratory path through the conceptual site model to impact these receptors. So with that, Howard, I will turn it over to you to help us with some of the risk mitigation strategies.
Thank you, Don. So first, it was in Emily's slide. My name's Howard Tolan, president of SterlingRisk. I work with lawyers and environmental consultants like Emily and Don, and particularly with Emily and Don, on all of these strategies to try to transfer the risk. One of Emily's slides had Dark Waters. It's a very entertaining movie, more entertaining than this presentation. I've usually seen movies one time. I've seen it 3 times, twice on the plane. But Rob Bilott is the person or the lawyer who went after DuPont, and we've had him at many of our conferences, the New York State Bar Association, and ultimately Mark Ruffalo plays him and goes through the history of how this all developed. At the same time, the insurance industry was attending similar conferences, studying this, and it's been an evolution of having to underwrite for perfluoros. One thing that Don and Emily mentioned is that they migrate to our premises and off of premises very easily and through water like other volatile organic compounds, and then they create vapor issues. But this particular contaminant or set of contaminants, as Don mentioned, it's thousands of contaminants. Only about 30 to 40 have been studied thus far, and a half dozen are in the process of being regulated by states and by the EPA. So insurance exclusions will be at some point catching up. You want to stay ahead of them and have coverage in place. The types of exposures that we see in claims across all volatile organic compounds are not only cleanup costs, but medical monitoring claims if you've been exposed and have high levels, for personal injury claims, off-site migration that leads to millions of dollars in losses of properties not being valued what they should be valued, and the business interruption from tenants leaving and saying that they were impacted by the contaminant. You'll also have municipalities and other regulators claiming, and other non-governmental organization types of groups claiming that natural resources were affected, that drinking water wells have to be taken out of use. In fact, we have litigation going on with 1,4-dioxane, another emerging contaminant, where like MTBE and other contaminants that were additives to solvents, they are in the drinking water. The drinking water, for many of these contaminants, do cause cancer and other illnesses. And once they have to be regulated, the water districts and other municipalities bring a claim against a variety of defendants. They start with product manufacturers. We have lawsuits where the product manufacturers have brought in the current property owners, and the current property owners have the third or fourth party in former property owners. So that's what we could expect to see in the world of claims for perfluoros. We find them when we go to clean up other contaminants that are being regulated, or when a property has to go through a study or preliminary assessment in phase 1 and phase 2, or they're being developed and you're digging in the ground and you see something suspicious and it leads to broader testing. And that's, again, not only on our property when we're doing development, but we're brought into claims often when a neighboring property goes to do development and they find something and they look to us as one of the responsible parties for their contamination. Next slide. So when a lawsuit or a claim comes in, a claim is just any written demand by any neighbor or regulatory agency. A lawsuit is obviously a filed litigation. We see all kinds of causes of action. These are all causes of action that we look to transfer to an insurance company, and most of the time, all of these can be transferred to an insurance company. Of course, PFAS is being particularly negotiated carefully with the help of environmental consultants like Don and lawyers like Emily, when we go to negotiate why there should not be an exclusion for PFAS. But there is now a focus on whether each policy should or should not have coverage for this category of claims as they pertain to a potential PFAS claim. Next slide. So there's a lot of different environmental insurance products to transfer the risk. I work with lawyers on most of these. The transactional deals we do, we could write insurance for up to 10 years. The longer we go out, the more risk there is to the insurance industry that there potentially could be a claim. And when we write portfolios of real estate, I just had one with Emily's firm with over 70 properties. And after we negotiated a 3-year policy, we ended up with a perfluoro, and it was an industrial portfolio. Keep in mind, we only ended up with a perfluoro exclusion for about 5 properties that were, had a long history of use of types of chemicals that would have had PFAS or perfluoros generally. It's a very broad class of carbon and fluorine and a bunch of different chemicals still being studied as we talked about. There's other products that we could more easily on a general risk transfer, not a transaction, but just adding pollution insurance or general liability, which is a 1-year policy, or project policies where we don't tend to end up with perfluoro exclusions at all. It's counterintuitive, but the shorter the duration and the broader of the portfolio we're looking at, there's a little bit less focus on the one transactional deal and one site in terms of getting actual coverage and not having an exclusion for anything having to do with perfluoro. Next slide. There's a lot of carriers that write environmental insurance. There's a few carriers that with initial writers of environmental insurance like Zurich and AIG that's no longer writing environmental insurance, at least for transactional deals. And it really does become a negotiation with multiple insurers when we're looking particularly at PFAS. And interestingly, PFAS is a big driver for why a carrier either wins a deal or doesn't win a deal. If we can get PFAS coverage, even if the premium's more, they're going to more likely get the deal, or at least, the three of us on the call will strongly suggest that that carrier win, because perfluoros is a scary, scary contaminant because of, how long it will take to clean up and the levels that we were talking about in the parts per trillion. So we want to avoid having a PFAS exclusion whenever we can. Next slide. So that's really, I'm going to wrap up and try to sum up what we all talked about with the key takeaways. The regulators are marching forward to regulate. So the earlier we can lock up coverage for emerging contaminants, they will not be excluded. If there's no exclusion and something is newly regulated, that's part of the coverage. Remediation liability, I think, is already in effect in like 20 states, and the EPA is around the corner, as was mentioned in the slide, next year, 2023. That's really going to catch the eye, not only of our insurance industry, but the reinsurers. And there might be new mandates that you just can never write PFAS coverage. So I think we've been saying this for 5 or so years, and it's harder and harder, but it may become in 2023 or maybe 2024 closer to impossible. Due diligence and careful due diligence. Yes.
Howard, let me jump in on this one, because this is actually a really key point that I didn't get to during my slides. And the scope of a phase 1 environmental site assessment, right, which is, everybody on this call knows what that is, and it's used for our due diligence defenses under federal law. Because PFAS chemicals are not currently hazardous substances under CERCLA, which give us less than a year, and we probably will be, they are not, as a default, included within the scope of a phase 1. So if you have a phase 1 report from a year or two that found no recs or no concerns about PFAS, they didn't flag it, it could be because it was not part of the scope. So when you're scoping out your phase 1, make sure that your consultant knows what PFAS is, because I've actually run into phase 1s where we said, what about that big explosion back in the 80s? They didn't know that firefighting foam was associated with PFAS contamination. So a clean phase 1, even if it's recent, may not necessarily close out or address the potential presence of PFAS. So that's an important practice point right there for today's commercial.
Right.
Real estate.
And I'll just add to
very
that,
important.
Emily,
Yeah, very important
from a practical standpoint, I've been involved with a number of deals where banks have come back and defaulted to, well, we're not going to proceed with a loan unless you go out and evaluate for PFAS. And we've been able to push back from the standpoint of, again, what I had mentioned is the generic labeling of an industry that might have PFAS. A good example is electroplating. Just because there was an electroplating operation does not equate that they use these PFAS related chemicals. Just because there was a fire doesn't mean that they use the AFF foam suppression system to put out that fire that created the PFAS on the property. So I can't overemphasize enough in that due diligence, you've got to mine deeper into the documentation in order to ferret that out. It can't be just, oh, there's plating, therefore go on to do a phase 2 with and evaluate PFAS in that phase.
Yeah, and that's a great example of the be PFAS smart exclamation point is right. Using facts. Because in the wild, wild west, you are going to get knee-jerk reactions, right? And the market is evolving from everywhere from lenders and investors to our insurance markets, to buyers, to tenants. Everybody's risk threshold is evolving and changing on a practically daily basis, right? And so, we've had many examples of where we got a PFAS exclusion under insurance for a plating operation. We dug a little deeper, pulled up those safety data sheets, no PFAS, we now have PFAS coverage, right?
So the last bullet, other than doing smart due diligence and not doing too much due diligence that you don't have to do, and making good arguments to the carrier as to why you don't have a wreck at the site and why it wasn't required to test. If you are going to test, you need to do it very strategically. That's what I talk to Don often about. And then if there is PFAS, and there's a policy already in place, particularly an environmental insurance policy in place, from years ago, it likely does not have an exclusion. These evolved in the last few years. So we may be able to make, and we often will be making, similar to other emerging contaminants, a claim under that environmental insurance policy. And there's lots of lawyers that have helped facilitate successful resolution of the claim, utilizing all of the services, and that runs the gamut with the environmental carriers making the investment from using your environmental consultant, your environmental lawyer, and a bunch of other coverages that are available, public relations and emergency response costs being covered. And as we mentioned earlier, all the business interruption loss in about 6 or 7 different carriers of extra categories of extra expense. And we also, we pursue all of those, and they make up a pretty significant component of most of our environmental claims. So, and the last takeaway again is if you haven't watched Dark Waters, watch that movie. It's a very, very good movie. We have one question. It has to do with, again, I think we may have answered this, but phase 1 site assessments and how they deal with PFAS. Don, you want to take that question?
Yeah, I think I was actually looking at that question when I answered, so I hope I captured it along with Emily. So excellent question. The one thing I will add, oftentimes we'll characterize some of the nature of PFAS as an environmental business risk. It's not a wreck. So it's kind of palatable both for us as a consultant who's ethically going through and dutifully identifying all the risks, but it's not a wreck, as Emily has clearly identified. So the lender or insurance carriers can reconcile, well, it's not a wreck, but it's been at least addressed as a potential business risk in that report. And that seems to meet everybody's needs as a reasonable settlement of the issue of PFAS. The new standard, the ASTM E1527, the newest one came out in 21. It has not been codified by the EPA, right, Emily?
Correct.
As a standard for AAI, but it has gone further to say that we must look at the potential for PFAS and other emerging contaminants when we're doing these evaluations, which is very difficult because, as you know, we're not doing any testing in a phase 1. It's purely record reviews to look at the potential for these different emerging contaminants.
And I'll also note the cousin of a phase 1 in the state of New Jersey is, of course, the preliminary assessment, right, which has different functions. It can be diligence, it can be part of site remediation or ISRA compliance, right, which has different permeations. But regardless, because we do have enforceable soil and groundwater remediation standards, the preliminary assessment should be addressing, right? And there is an obligation and under NJDP guidance materials to eventually, at some point, the potential risk of PFAS needs to be affirmatively addressed, either saying that there is no risk or identifying if there is a risk and if site investigation is required. So that's separate and distinct from a phase 1, but also can be an issue in the diligence phase for a New Jersey property. I had one other question, and I don't know if we have any others there, but Howard, you brought up a great point about finding PFAS in the context of ongoing cleanups, right? So if you have like your chlorinateds or other volatile chemicals, during that process, and especially in New York, right? Because New York is requiring the additional sampling. So then you're in the context of a chlorinated cleanup, and then you have the PFAS chemicals, which are for you, because those chemicals are so different and I think right. I mean, so they're both go where water goes, but does the PFAS also volatilize, or how does that work in that conceptual site model that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, it's a really good issue. I mean, we have many other chemicals that are much more volatile and have what is called the Henry's Law constant, which is the governing type of characteristic of that chemical to have the ability to volatilize and potentially impact and, interior structures primarily as the ultimate receptor to soil vapor coming usually from groundwater, but sometimes soil sources. Most of the PFAS that have been studied, now again, it's evolving, have not risen to that being a key risk. It's all really been driven, with first and foremost, as I mentioned, with groundwater, surface water, soil sediment of late in New Jersey, now that that's been regulated. But
right, so then the air deposition is driven by the water droplets.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Water droplets.
You're talking about,
air.
There's two different things. There's the air emissions, which is really more of a deposition agent for PFAS distributed across a broad region. A good example of that is the major facility down in South Jersey that's been studied extensively. They've now found that there's evidence of the emission from that plant in New Hampshire, okay, to show you how.
As I understand, there's some question about the validity, the reliability.
There is some question of validity. I think New Hampshire's blaming New Jersey once again for their contaminants. but no, seriously, it is a broad plume from an air emission standpoint in these fine, droplets and other aerosols that ultimately get deposited in a broad region, usually at fairly low concentrations. But again, we're in parts per trillion, so it doesn't take much. Remember the one eyedropper in an Olympic-sized swimming pool.
And again, it's in our bodies, from what I understand, because mostly of drinking water, somewhat of incidental soil and dust ingestion, and then actually in our diet and foods from fish, seafood, and even homegrown produce.
And food packaging.
And food packaging, right?
Yep. Anything that is grease resistant, right? To prevent sticking or non-stick.
Shiny wrappers.
Yep. Pizza boxes is a famous example. Yeah. So there's multiple exposure points, which is one of the reasons why the regulatory standards are so astronomically low, is because it's difficult to really get your arms around all of the different exposure points when you're dealing from a public health standpoint. Right. So we are coming up on 2:45. I do want to make sure if there are any other questions or comments from our participants, that we get an opportunity to do that, because as you can tell, Howard, Don, and I could talk about this probably all day, but we won't subject the rest of the crew here to that.
Thank you, everybody, for
thank you, and look forward to the follow-up. We'll be sending some follow-up information to all the participants to provide additional links and other helpful information. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the afternoon. Happy holidays.
Yep. Take care.